did a great job. That's really all I can say.
It looked a little bit tricky at the restart from that safety car. You want to use softs there. It's difficult to keep the Nico behind you.
Yeah, just didn't have any speed at the end.
And what do you take from this triple header as a whole? How much have you learned about the car?
Can a 7 times world champion feel completely lost aboard one of the most legendary cars in history? And how does it happen from an almost spiritual connection with your car to wish to never have run? Today we are going to tour an emotional roller coaster that no other pilot could tell with as much intensity as Lewis Hamilton in his adventure with Ferrari. The Imola race was much more than a simple comeback in the standings for Lewis Hamilton. It was an emotional catharsis, a moment of turning that redefined his connection with Ferrari and with the car that had so many headaches caused him in the first bars of the season. For the first time since his historic transfer, the British found that harmony between man and machine that he had been looking for since the beginning of the championship, a tuning that had shown himself elusive even during the preseason tests and that seemed almost utopian during the first dates. From free training, something different was perceived in Hamilton's attitude. More concentrated, more expressive in their feedback with engineers, but above all more serene. Everything seemed to be in the right place, and when that happens in a circuit as technical and demanding as Imola, the results do not take to reflect it. In classification, despite a modest result, an advance in the car balance was already glimpsed. However, it was during the main race where this improvement became a real rebirth. The decision to start with hard tires, a risky play in strategic terms, became a tactical masterpiece. As the laps progressed, Hamilton began to trace with a fluidity that evoked his best days in Formula One. Each overtaking was surgical, every faster than the previous one, and the most notable of everything, he did it without forcing the limits of the car. It was as if the SF-25 and Hamilton had finally found that perfect midpoint between aggressiveness and control, between risk and performance. The psychological impact of that emotional bond cannot be underestimated. For a pilot who has built much of his career in highly rational and technical environments such as McLaren and Mercedes, discovering a more emotional, more visceral dimension of motoring was, in his own words, inspiring. For the first time in a long time, Hamilton was not only competing for results. He was running for the love of the fans, for the historical connection, for the symbol that Ferrari represents. And that, for someone of his career, meant rewriting his own personal narrative within Formula One. The performance was not perfect. It finished fourth. He did not go to the podium. But in the context of what had been its season until then, that fourth place was worth as much as a victory. It was a message for the world of Formula One. Hamilton not only still has talent, has also recovered emotional motivation. And when both elements are combined, the result is a force that can change the course of a championship. The weekend in Monaco was a brutal reality blow for Lewis Hamilton and his incipient relationship with Ferrari. If in Imola he had experienced an almost spiritual connection with the SF-25, in the narrow and treacherous streets of the Principality he was forced to face the other face of his new adventure. Technical frustration, emotional disconnection, and the feeling of being trapped in a maze without exit. Monaco does not forgive. There is no room for error. And when the balance between pilot and car breaks, the punishment is immediate, relentless, ruthless. From the first free training session, it was clear that the car was not in the optimal range. The Ferrari was nervous at the curve entrance, unstable in the outputs and with a rear aerodynamic load that seemed insufficient for a path where trust is the key ingredient for performance. Hamilton not only fought against chronometers, he struggled to understand why what had worked in Imola no longer made sense in Monaco. The track, narrow and technical, amplified every small imperfection of the car. And in a scenario where the margins are measured in millimeters, that lack of trust became a slab. At the strategic level, the team also failed to read the rhythm of the classification. Ferrari failed to give Hamilton a clean track window at the critical moment of Q3, which ended up condemning him to an exit position away from the competitive area. In Monaco, a bad classification is practically a sentence of mediocrity. And that was exactly what happened. From the start of the race, Hamilton was stuck in traffic, unable to display his true rhythm, forced to keep tires and manage temperatures without being able to attack. It was like seeing a caged lion. The pilot's body language said everything. His radio tone became tense, irritable. In each message to his engineer, the contained anxiety of who knows that he is wasting an opportunity on a track where he had historically shown was noticed. His history in Monaco includes memorable victories and legendary poles, but this 2025 edition only served to remind him how far he was from that dominant pilot. Not due to lack of capacity, but because the car simply did not respond to its commands with the surgical precision required by an urban circuit. But frustration was not just technique. It was emotional. The contrast with Imola could not be more violent. There he had felt the heat of the tifosi, the synergy with the equipment, the roar of the engine as an extension of his will. In Monaco, all that evaporated. Communication with the engineers became cold, almost robotics. The strategy was defensive, reactive, lacking conviction. And when a pilot such as Hamilton perceives that the team doubts, it is inevitable that those doubts also reach him. Monaco was a deep wound not because of the result itself, but for what he revealed, that the connection achieved in Imola was not yet solid enough to survive the most demanding environments. That the SF-25 at times remained an indomitable machine. That Ferrari, despite its history and resources, still makes strategic mistakes that their elite rivals have already learned to avoid. And above all, that Hamilton's adaptation to Maranello's technical and emotional environment would be slower and more painful than he had anticipated. This was the first great setback in his way with Ferrari. A reminder that each step forward can be followed from two back. But also a necessary test. Because in Formula One championships, no legacies are not built without going through the fire of frustration. And Monaco was, for Hamilton, an emotional bonfire that still did not go out. The third stop of the 2025 calendar in the circuit of Barcelona Catalunya became more than a race for Lewis Hamilton. It was a painful mirror that reflected all the cracks of its relationship with the SF-25, with Ferrari, and with its own emotional state after months of pressure contained. If the light had glimpsed in Imola and the alarm signals lit, Spain was the confirmation that something fundamental was not working. Not in the car. Not in the strategy. In himself. In his desire, his motivation, and his energy to continue in a project that, at least for a moment, seemed to crumble. Since Friday's training, Hamilton's body language was different. There was no trace of the enthusiasm that characterized him in Imola, or the fierce commitment to the development he showed in the winter tests. Instead, a disconnected, almost resigned pilot appeared, who transmitted a feeling of psychological wear before even getting into the car. The Barcelona circuit, traditionally a technical reference to evaluate the real potential of the cars, became a battlefield where Hamilton not only fought against the stopwatch, but against its internal frustration. The SF-25 was particularly unstable throughout the weekend. Balance problems were evident. The car suffered from subviring in the slow curves and unexpected flying in the rapids, a lethal combination that made it impossible to find a consistent rhythm. Hamilton reported on radio multiple times that the car does not respond, a phrase that, in his mouth, is never casual, because it did not refer only to a technical issue. He talked about accumulated wear. From the impotence of seeing how the car did not evolve at its pace, how the promised improvements did not work or did not work, how the emotional connection with the project weakened career after a career. But the most raw moment did not arrive on the track, but outside it. After the race, in statements that went around the world, Hamilton was brutally honest. "I want to go home." A lapidary phrase, impossible to misunderstand. It was not a banal complaint or a tantrum for a bad result. It was the testimony of a pilot who, for the first time in many years, felt that he had touched back. That the effort was not being reciprocated. That his talent, his work, his dedication were being lost in a machinery that did not end up engaging. And that sincerity hurt more than any abandonment or accident. Because he revealed Hamilton's true emotional commitment with his new challenge. He had not reached Ferrari to appear. He had arrived to win. To mark an era. To close his career with a glory narrative in the style of the great champions of the past. But what he found in Barcelona was the opposite. An environment still under construction with strategic fissures, internal communication problems, and a car whose development seemed stagnant. The coup was not only personal, but symbolic. Because Barcelona is a circuit where the maturity of the projects is measured. Where teams show if they have been able to evolve since winter. And while McLaren and Mercedes advanced, Ferrari stumbled. And Hamilton felt it as a silent betrayal of all the sacrifice made since he signed for Maranello. The sensations of the car were so bad that even the most basic corrections, such as suspended adjustments, braking distribution, or aerodynamic load, seemed not to take effect. It was like driving a car in autopilot, where the answers no longer depended on the pilot but on chaos. The most dangerous thing was not the lack of rhythm, but the emotional wear that this impotence generated. Because in a long and demanding championship such as 2025, losing motivation as soon in the season can have devastating effects. Spain was not just a bad result. It was an existential warning. A reminder that even the largest can falter when the project they lead is not up to their expectations. At that time, the dream of conquering a title with Ferrari felt further than ever. And for the first time since it reached Formula One, Lewis Hamilton gave clear signs of wanting to disconnect, to need space, to rethink the way. Because in Barcelona he did not lose a race. He lost faith. And in a sport where trust is everything, that can be the beginning of the end. The first great arch of Lewis Hamilton with Ferrari in 2025 has been revealed as an emotional study in contrast. In just 3 races, he has lived the exaltation of rediscovery, the disappointment of a technical disconnection, and the raw impact of a demotivation that seemed inconceivable in a pilot of his caliber. This start of the season is not simply an adaptation phase. It is, in many ways, a battle between myth and reality. Between the legend of a pilot who has conquered everything and the rawness of a team that, even with his story, struggles to offer him the environment to shine. What happened in Emilia-Romagna showed what it could be. A balanced car, an accurate strategy, a fertile emotional environment. It was a flash of what can arise when Hamilton's talent aligns with Ferrari's technical capacity. But that moment was ephemeral. Monaco and Spain presented the limits of SF-25 and, even more worrying, the limits of Hamilton's patience. Each radio message, each post-carrier statement, every gesture of frustration in the garage were chapters of a narrative that no longer is only about track performance, but about the emotional stability of a pilot who has stopped hiding his vulnerability. And it is precisely this vulnerability that humanizes Hamilton and gives him an even more powerful dimension within sport. Because it is no longer the number of titles he has won, or how many poles he has achieved. This is what you are willing to cross to achieve a new peak in your career. And right now, that path is cobbled with doubts, pending adjustments and crucial decisions that will mark their legacy.